Milhares de documentos secretos do governo americano caem num site da internet, WikiLeaks, especializado em acolher informações proibidas ao público, enviadas de forma anônima. O site abriga textos ou vídeos como este, do ano passado, com uma filmagem interna e secreta do Pentágono, mostrando o disparo de um helicóptero americano contra o solo em Bagdá, operação desastrosa que resultou na morte de 18 civis, inclusive 2 jornalistas da agência Reuters. Quando o responsável pelo site WikiLeaks, o australiano Julian Assange, recebeu vasto material bruto sobre as guerras no Iraque e no Afeganistão, além de numerosa correspondência diplomática do governo americano, a documentação era suficiente para preencher 2.000 livros grossos. Ele decidiu então fazer um acordo com a mídia tradicional para obter ajuda na seleção e conseguir mais impacto internacional. Abriu acesso ao jornal britânico The Guardian e ao americano The New York Times, bem como à revista alemã Der Spiegel, para analisarem e publicarem o que achassem apropriado. Os jornalistas selecionaram, conferiram, deram contexto e revelaram detalhes das comunicações sem censura entre soldados e oficiais na frente de luta, bem como a troca de mensagens entre diplomatas americanos pelo mundo e seus chefes em Washington. Foi um dos maiores furos jornalísticos das últimas décadas. Esses foram apenas alguns entre muitos outros segredos revelados no trabalho conjunto de WikiLeaks e jornalistas. Uma relação que logo se tornou hostil, sobretudo no trato com Assange. Ele não gostou quando ambos os jornais publicaram críticas a ele, apontando uma personalidade que mistura inteligência, arrogância e mistério. Assange se enfureceu, sobretudo quando o Guardian revelou detalhes oficiais do processo na Suécia por supostos abusos sexuais, crime que ele nega ter cometido. Novas revelações continuam a sair até hoje, como as 10 páginas no Guardian em abril, com segredos da prisão americana de Guantánamo. As revelações correram o mundo. 2 jornalistas do Guardian que lidaram com Assange e comandaram a edição dos documentos secretos do WikiLeaks, publicados no Diário Britânico, escreveram este livro, lançado em vários países, inclusive no Brasil. O Milênio conversou em Londres com um dos autores, o editor de investigações e coordenador do projeto WikiLeaks no Guardian, David Leigh.
This remarkable partnership between The Guardian, the New York Times, and Der Spiegel, and then later on other organizations joined in, it may not have been easy. You know, people have different editorial priorities. How did that work out, that combination?
Well, it was a very unusual partnership and a very rickety partnership in the sense that it was a miracle, really, that it held together as long as it did for several months. I mean, 2 aspects of it were very difficult. On the one hand, you've got the partnership between all the news of the conventional news organizations, and they're from different time zones, they're from different cultures, they're from different languages. You know, we had a weekly magazine in Germany, we had a daily in New York on a different time zone. You know, we had The Guardian here, we had El País and Le Monde. Le Monde is an afternoon paper, we're a morning paper. Trying to produce some kind of coordinated schedule of when we were going to do this stuff and not scoop each other, you know, made our heads hurt. That was part of the problem. But the other problem was you had this group of mainstream media, as the online people call it, trying to collaborate with a bunch of anarchists, as my own editor referred to them at one point correctly.
WikiLeaks, you mean?
I mean WikiLeaks, yes, yes, whose ideology is completely different to ours, and who indeed seemed to manifest a considerable hostility and contempt towards the people that they were supposedly cooperating with.
You're part of the establishment, as it were.
Exactly.
That's another aspect of journalism people often forget, that journalists actually select things. That's the part of the everyday work. You don't publish everything you got. And naturally, editorial principles and values come into the picture. That probably justifies a lot of the difference, besides a different national perspective, doesn't it?
Well, you pay your money and you take your choice. I mean, that's why some people buy The Guardian, because they value our view of the world. Some people buy The New York Times because they value their take on the world. These different takes on the world are what you pay for.
We still face the old problems when you're dealing with all this raw material from WikiLeaks, which is the old journalistic thing of raw information. How do you ascertain legitimacy and accuracy? How did you handle that?
The first problem that we faced was a severe technical one, because how on earth do you actually study and analyze this huge mass of material? 250,000 diplomatic cables is 300 million words. It was the equivalent of 2,000 books in a library. No human being could read through all that stuff and make judgments. So what we had to do first of all was build a database and then work out ways of searching it for key themes, key words, key places, key dates that would enable us to see aspects of what was going on in the world. And then, you know, we had to decide what the stories were, what it all meant. And there's something about these documents that's important to say. The WikiLeaks people, Julian Assange and these WikiLeaks ideologies, they believe that there's some kind of sacred quality to a document. Of course, as a professional journalist, you know that's not true. A document, it does have a value because it can't be changed. It's crystallized, it's there. But on the other hand, what is in it isn't Holy Writ. It's just what some people decided to put down on a piece of paper at some particular moment. So what a US diplomat decided it would be a good idea to cable back to Washington at any particular time may or may not be important. It may just be something that they picked up in the street. It may be that they want to give a good impression about something. It may be that they're telling their superiors what they want to hear. You have to evaluate why people are making reports in documents, and that's what professional journalists do.
As part of that job, you obviously choose to leave a lot of material out. With this wealth of material, the stuff you left out, was it because you considered, as you said, unimportant, boring, or was there anything sensitive you just decided, other than names, that you decided to leave out?
The US State Department did try and persuade us at one point that, for example, we shouldn't run a lot of the reports from Yemen because it was too sensitive, they said, and you know, there might be a political blow-up in Yemen. We rejected that, and I don't believe that there's anything that we in The Guardian withheld for reasons of political sensitivity. We did withhold names because we didn't want them to suffer reprisals. And we did too, in The Guardian's own publication, withhold accusations of corruption, for example, against individuals that couldn't be verified because we're subject to British libel law. It was rather exasperating then that we had some rather crazy complaints from WikiLeaks and co. that we were censoring stuff about corruption. And we even had the Russians and people writing in Kremlin-backed papers saying, oh, we were suppressing information about the behavior of Western corporations. I mean, this is all rubbish. We had to comply with the libel laws of our own country.
A part of the deal was, you know, you had an agreement both with the Assange and WikiLeaks people, plus the other newspapers. It had to do with the timing, embargo, the proper moment to get it all out. But at no stage was there any money involved in this operation. Nobody was paid for anything for the services or for providing the material.
Absolutely no money involved as far as we were concerned and as far as our media partners were concerned.
Bill Keller, the editor of the New York Times, who was in command about all this, wrote that the value of these documents is that they expose deep secrets, not just that they expose deep secrets, but they add a bit to our knowledge and provide texture, nuance, and drama. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, these documents are immensely educational. There were very few sensations in them in the sense that they reveal who killed President Kennedy or something like that. They certainly did provide new unvarnished light on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that we haven't seen before. For example, the casualty figures. The Americans had always said we don't do body counts in Iraq. Well, it turned out they did. And they chart in these records 66,000 casualties, civilian casualties, in every single incident, supposedly, that happened during the war. So that added to our knowledge a lot. And in many ways, that's really the most important aspect of these leaks. In other respects, particularly about the diplomatic cables, they fill out the picture. often they say things very frankly that are said in public in guarded terms about, for example, the way Russia is a corrupt mafia state in many respects, or that Afghanistan, for example, the Afghan politician was described bluntly in these cables turning up at Dubai airport with $52 million in a suitcase. Not the kind of thing you read normally that American diplomats say. So it gives people an unvarnished window on the world, and that's very educational, and that has to be good, particularly in a world where there's so much misinformation, disinformation, and sheer ignorance.
It provides an extra insight, for instance, when it says that the governments of Tunisia and Egypt and other Arab governments are corrupt. We kind of knew that, but that put in a new light, didn't it?
Well, not only a new light, but a very sort of specific, unusual light. For example, in Tunisia, that a relative of the president was so outrageous in his behavior that he kept tigers in his garden, you know. That's the kind of concrete detail that brings it home to you, what kind of life these people lead.
And in that specific case, it was eventually read by the Tunisians, who, although they kind of knew about it by reading it, but they got really upset, so upset that they overthrew the government.
Well, I think it was certainly a factor in the political excitement that overthrew the government. I wouldn't have said it was the cause of it. That would be to boast unreasonably.
Talking about the backlash, when these things came out, there were a lot of, well, there was a lot of support, but a lot of protests, especially in the U.S. You had calls from right-wingers, Sarah Palin type, who said these WikiLeaks people should be prosecuted like a Taliban militant. And some people called for the death penalty and treason and all that stuff. Overreaction?
It's very depressing the way some people in the United States, especially politicians who ought to know better, react to any problem by calling for everybody to be killed. You know, I mean, it's not attractive. It makes America look bad in the eyes of the rest of the world. It makes them, you know, overly violent, over-aggressive, and it's a kind of spasm that you saw after 9/11, when, in a sort of vengeful spasm, America went and, you know, it basically attacked a lot of other people. So I think that's demonstrated something rather alarming and unhealthy about the United States body politic. I mean, it's crazy. You know, people like Sarah Palin, they didn't ought to be allowed to call for the killing of people who've merely leaked embarrassing information. No Americans have died as a result of all this. And you see there the rage of people who thought of themselves as belonging to the world's sole victorious superpower when they're crossed or challenged, and that rage isn't a pretty sight.
You mentioned before that there was an attempt by the State Department to try to hold you back, to prevent you from going ahead with certain things. What did they try to do?
I think the way the State Department engaged with us was actually quite interesting and quite civilized. We were relieved to discover at an early stage that they weren't going to try and come after us on The Guardian. I mean, we described this in the book. Instead, they were willing to engage with us. And of course, the New York Times had always been very willing to engage with the State Department and the White House, and they had told them in advance that we had this material and we were going to publish it. And they took a deliberate decision, which we accepted, that they would notify the US administration ahead of time. So we had quite a civilized process in which they said, well, they came here, you know, they came to The Guardian and said, you know, will you listen to us? Can we make representations? And we said, go ahead. And, you know, people from the US Embassy came here and talked to the editor. We had a meeting. And then they said, you know, will you speak on the phone to people in Washington? And we said, yes, we will. And we ended up talking to people like Philip Crowley, for example, the State Department spokesman, and other Clinton people. Crowley's now been forced to resign by criticizing what the US military are doing to Bradley Manning, so it's a little bit ironic. We had a pretty civilized conversation, the main burden of which was, we don't want you to name people who might suffer reprisals. And we were saying, listen, we're not going to do that. We've already taken that decision that we're going to behave in a sensible way about this. And then they were saying, oh, well, there's all this other stuff, you know. that's very sensitive, and would you listen to representations from us? And we said we'll listen to anything. But in the end, we did not censor anything because of political request.
You mentioned the way Manning has been treated. Let's deal with the unavoidable aspect of this thing, Julian Assange himself. The Australian-born former hacker, 40-year-old creator. Your book makes it clear you do not have a very high opinion of him.
I hope that we describe his personality, which is pretty strange, in the book in a fair-minded way. A lot of people regard Julian as a hero, as a sort of guerrilla warrior, you know, who's fighting the establishment all over the world. And I think some of the things he's done are very remarkable and pioneering. Problem is, he has a personality that it's impossible to work with. And he behaves in an impossible way. He's paranoid, he's untrustworthy, he's gets himself into trouble. We saw he got himself into trouble. He's been accused of sexual assaults in Sweden, and we've had a falling out with him.
I mean, the Guardian, you personally, or just the Guardian and
well, both me personally and the Guardian. Yeah. He thinks I'm a very bad person, and he said some very hostile things about me personally, because I insisted on not betraying the New York Times, who were one of our original partners. Julian had a row with them. He didn't like something they'd written and decided he was going to cut them out of the deal, and he was going to secretly open negotiations with the Washington Post. And I thought this was all a pretty bad idea. And I insisted on sharing the material with the New York Times all the same. And Julian then flew into a huge rage, and we had a huge row. And he came in here with his lawyer and threatened to sue us and said we were stealing his property and crazy stuff like that.
Well, the same way he didn't like what the New York Times published about him, he also didn't like when one of your reporters went to Sweden and got details of his court case, the sexual charges against him. What's the situation on those charges? I mean, what is public about? What do we know about that situation?
Well, what we didn't like about what was going on with the charges was that Julian was putting out the suggestion across the world that he was the victim of some kind of CIA honey trap, you know, that these women had been sent to entrap him or were making essentially false complaints. We'd investigated the whole situation because we were very concerned about it, and we discovered pretty well what had happened. And what had happened was Julian had had sexual relations with two young women, two admirers of WikiLeaks, in rapid succession. And in each case, he'd been unwilling to wear a condom, and they'd become very upset as a result of it. One claimed he'd deliberately ripped the condom. The other claimed that he had had sex with her while she was asleep, you know, without a condom, and she was upset about that. And these two women, when they got together, they didn't want to have him arrested. They wanted him to take an AIDS test. They thought that one of their problems was they were worried they might have caught something. They wanted him to take a test. He refused, and they said, if you don't do it, we're going to go to the police. And he said, well, I'm not going to. And they went to the police. So the whole thing would never have happened if Julian hadn't, first of all, upset these two women by his behavior, and secondly, had done what they wanted, which was to have an AIDS test. So, you know, there's no CIA honey trap in that story.
As we speak, he's waiting, appealing a decision that he should be extradited to Sweden. And of course, part of his argument all along is that if he's extradited to Sweden, he will end up in the US, and he will be sent to court, and he will face a death penalty. Do you think he's being paranoid with that?
This is all complete rubbish. First of all, if the US wanted to extradite him, they could extradite him from the UK much more easily than they could from Sweden. The UK has a very easy extradition treaty with the US. From Sweden, it'll be harder. Furthermore, if he's extradited to Sweden on these sex charges, he cannot be then extradited to the US on different charges, on charges related to free speech, without the consent of the UK, because you can't be extradited to Sweden on one set of charges and then extradited further on to another. So he's no worse off if he goes to Sweden. And I think the truth of all this is that Julian very much doesn't want, understandably perhaps, to be extradited to Sweden to have to face these sexual assault charges, and it's a PR strategy to make a noise about being sent to Guantanamo Bay, and I don't think it does him credit.
As a final thought on this topic, WikiLeaks is just the latest manifestation of an internet phenomenon that we're all facing in different areas, but also in the news area. You're a veteran in the news business. You've seen this transition. How much has your work changed because of that?
Well, my work has changed utterly because of the onset of the internet age, and everything about this WikiLeaks story is something that would never have happened at the beginning of my career as a journalist. You know, everything revolves around the internet here. This young soldier is accused of leaking material that was on the internet because the United States State Department had put all their cables on the internet so that they were accessible from classified websites to other embassies and other government departments. That's an amazing change in the way diplomacy is conducted and the way intelligence is shared. Then, the fact that you can actually have people leaking this stuff by having software methods of scraping it all out of an American military computer and then uploading it to some other people and leaking it to the world, that's completely new. And finally, it's completely new as journalists that we should be presented with this giant, massive material and have to find ways of, first of all, analyzing, interpreting it, and even reading it, you know, in methods we never had to use before. And then finding ways of publishing it worldwide, which is what we never used to do as journalists, in ways that are not going to get us sued or arrested. So everything about this enterprise is completely different from what went on when I started out in print journalism all those years ago.
Overall, after all these months of dealing with it, do you think it's this whole WikiLeaks bit, is it a force for good? Is it a dangerous thing? Is it being misused? Or it has the potential of being misused? What's your overall appraisal?
I've been campaigning for quite a long time about the dangers of large databases. In Britain, in particular, I've regarded it as very dangerous that they were proposing to compile a database with every single citizen's medical records on it. Because my view was, as soon as you invent a database like that, you bring into existence something that wasn't there before, which can be leaked and will be leaked, and people will get at it, you know. And I didn't want outsiders, whether it's the government or private detectives or other tabloid newspapers or commercial corporations, getting at my medical data. And I think, you know, a lot of people would feel the same way. It's the same with this stuff. Once the technology develops to the point where huge databases are brought into being, you've got a problem. Not everything in them should be leaked, but it will be leaked. And if Julian Assange hadn't set up WikiLeaks and pioneered it, then somebody else would have done something similar, because it's all driven by the technology. Once you see the technical possibilities, then it will happen.
All we're waiting for now is for Hollywood. We understand the rights of your book have been sold to Steven Spielberg. So the main question, and my last question, who's going to play you, Robert Redford or Dustin Hoffman?
Well, it was Robert Redford who played Woodward in the All the President's Men, wasn't it? Which was always the icon that I had before me as a young reporter. That would be very nice, but I guess he's aging and so am I.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Se você quiser mais uns trechos desta entrevista e mais detalhes sobre o assunto, acesse o blog do Milênio no site da Globo News.